Hi, Jason Gaston here, the Freedom Flipper, with another episode of Wholesaling Real Estate 101. What I want you to do before we get into the content of this video is click on the link below this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also go to freedomflippingacademy.com, and your email address there to get our free ebook, Top 7 Ways to Find Deals That Most People Have Never Heard of. So, the topic we're going to talk about today is what is a double closing. Now, this is a common question we hear because the term is used often. So, many times when we wholesale a property, or we call it wholesaling, really it's moving paper, but many times we just assign our contract. So we have a purchase and sale contract with our seller, and we assign that contract to our end buyer. Therefore, there's no funding involved because we're making an assignment fee. When we assign that contract to that end buyer, that contract belongs to them now, so they're in control of that contract. So we just make our fee and we're out. We're done. Our wholesaling profit and we're out and we're done. But many times, if you're buying a property, maybe there's a large profit you're making in the wholesale, or if it's a bank-owned property, or if it's a property that's listed with a real estate agent, many times some of those contracts will not be assignable. Now, many times I also to this day still do a lot of assignments of contracts, so it doesn't take any cash out of my pocket to do that. But if I'm dealing with someone who has a contract that's not assignable, then I have to do what's called a double close. So technically, they used to be able to do what's called a simultaneous closing. What that means is that your end buyer's cash, when he bought it, would pay for the first closing when you close a property in a double close. It's called simultaneous closing. And now that's kind of frowned upon. Many places still do it, but it's a little frowned upon. So a way around all those things is to do what's called a double close. So here's what a double close is. So whenever you put on a house under contract with the seller that you're looking to wholesale, you put the house under contract. Once you put the house under contract, you also find a buyer, a cash buyer, and you put the house under contract also with that cash buyer. So what happens is, in order to do that, in order to make that work, you have to have a first closing first. So what happens is you have what's called an A to B closing. A to B closing is a closing between the seller of the property and you, the wholesaler. So, and a lot of people, what happens, some people will use their own funds, but also there are companies that do what's called transactional funding. So what transactional funding is they will put up the funds for your first closing. So you have that closing, but the closing is back to back. What that means is it's all happening in the same day, sometimes and many times within a few minutes of each other. So what happens is you have a first closing, and a transactional funder covers that closing for you. Now they're going to charge some transactional funders charge a flat fee. Some of them charge a certain amount of points or an interest rate or things. But most of I like to deal with ones where there's a flat fee. So what happens is with the transactional funding that I use, usually that flat fee is like $1,000 to $2,000. So in order to use this transactional funder's money, I have to pay them $1,000 to $2,000 to use their money for maybe an hour or two at a title company. But what happens is this transactional funder will not fund your first closing until your end buyer, the cash buyer, has already sent the money into the title company for their closing, because they want to make sure they're covered. So what happens is you have this A to B transaction, your transactional funder covers that, and that's either with an interest rate, a flat fee, or points on the loan. So you have that first closing, and then you pay off that transactional funder when you close the deal with your cash buyer. So what happens when the cash buyer buys, it pays off your transactional funding, and also you get the difference between that. But something that does happen when you do what's called a double close is you're gonna incur closing costs twice. You're gonna have closing costs twice. So you're gonna have closing costs on the A to B side, and there's gonna be closing costs on the B to C side. Now, in a typical closing, on the A to B closing, standard closing, you would cover the buy side of the closing cost, and you also would pay the sell side of the second transaction. So that means you're going to pay closing costs here and closing costs here. But what happens many times in negotiations, to get a property under contract to wholesale, we will get the property under contract, and we will, in order to negotiate the price down, we will offer to pay their closing costs. In that case, you're paying all the closing costs for the seller and buyer, for the seller and yourself on the A to B closing, on an A to B transaction, and then you're paying the seller closing costs on the cash buyer side. But what I try to do many times is push all these closing costs to the cash buyer, because I'm already providing them a good deal. So many times we can push all that. But if it comes down to it, then you could possibly have to pay all the closing costs for the A and B side, and the seller and the sell side closing costs for the B side, because the buyer, cash buyer, is going to handle their closing costs. Or if you have a good relationship with your buyer, you can just push all the closing costs his direction to get a clear fee for your wholesale, a clear profit for your wholesale. So the reason you use transactional funding is if you're dealing with someone who has a contract that is not assignable, or maybe if there's a large profit you're making there, and some people just naturally, as a regular way of doing business, always close on that A to B side. I still assign project. We still assign contracts sometimes, but the truth is, transactional funding, we call it wholesaling. A lot of wholesaling is just really, we call it wholesaling, but it's really just selling paper, assigning your contract to someone else. But when you actually have two closings, that's real wholesaling, because you're buying low and you're reselling again. So double closing, A to B transaction between the seller and you, a B2C transaction between you and your cash buyer. A transactional funding covers that for a fee, and then you have to pay extra closing costs, and then you make the difference between. So what happens is it can eat into your profit a little bit if you're paying all the closing costs here and half the closing costs here, if you don't push all the closing costs to your end buyer. But in order to push that closing cost to your end buyer, you got to provide a real value for them. So our value as wholesalers is we're out marketing, we're cold calling, sending direct mail, putting out bandit signs, a whole host of different things you can use to generate motivated seller leads. So we're putting a lot of effort in. So we're marketing, we're visiting the properties, we're taking pictures of those properties, we're putting together a package of that property and marketing that to our buyers. So the reason we make that wholesale profit and we can push those closing costs onto that buyer is because we're doing a lot of work for that cash buyer. That buyer doesn't have to market to find a deal, because we're already providing that service to them. So that's why we get that wholesale profit, is because we're providing we're providing a service to that cash buyer by bringing them a deal, by marketing, visiting properties, taking pictures, analyzing deals, estimating repairs, to make sure we provide a quality product. Well, not quality, it's still going to need work, but quality, real numbers for our cash buyers. So at the end of the day, if they buy it to renovate and sell it, then there's profit on the table for them. Or if they buy it to rent it out as cash flow property, then they're getting a nice return on their investment. So what is double closing? It's when you have two closings. A closing between the seller and you, and then another closing between you and your buyer, with a transactional funder covering the cost of your first closing for a fee, and then your cash buyer, when you close this in, it pays off your seller. Your seller's already paid off through transactional funding, but it pays back your transactional funding loan, and that's all done back to back, like on the same day. So what is a double closing? It's a back to back closing on the same day, within hours of each other, using transactional funding. One closing, second closing, all involving the same property, the same house. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.